Yo everyone, and massive welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into something super crucial if you're playing with data in the Microsoft Cloud locking down security in Fabric. You sent over some seriously insightful stuff, including a detailed walkthrough called Microsoft Fabric Security 101, our mission today, to cut through the jargon and surface the absolute must-know strategies for keeping your Fabric environment, well, Fort Knox level secure.
Exactly. We know security can sometimes feel like a huge mountain to climb, right? But think of us as your Sherpas for this trek. We're going to break down all the essential layers of protection you need to be thinking about. We'll zero in on what's most important and, why it directly impacts you. We'll even unpack some real-world scenarios and the demos that were shared with us.
All right, let's not waste any time then. Based on what you've shared, we're going from the literal nuts and bolts of Microsoft's data center security all the way to encrypting your data when it's just sitting there at rest. Consider this your express lane to understanding Fabric security best practices. Okay, let's get right into the physical layer, how Microsoft actually protects the servers and hardware.
Yeah, and what's fascinating right off the bat is just the sheer number of security layers involved, even physically. We're talking about serious barriers, multiple checkpoints, the kind of security you'd, expect for truly critical infrastructure. The likelihood of someone, pulling off a physical data heist is, as the source material points out, incredibly slim. Almost like a movie plot.
Totally a movie plot. But the material also brings up scenarios that feel much more grounded. The less dramatic stuff, but still disruptive, like power failures, maybe glitches during software updates, and even natural disasters. I actually remember this one time, way back, we had a server room flood. Not fun. A week I'd rather forget. So how does Fabric handle these more, realistic kinds of threats?
Right, so if we zoom out a bit, Microsoft uses what they call availability zones within each Azure region. Think of these as at least 3 completely separate data centers in that area. Now, the crucial part for you is that your Fabric data and services are replicated across these zones. So if there's a localized hiccup in one data center, like a power outage,
the other 2 are designed to pick up the slack.
Exactly. They keep things humming. You might see a brief stutter or, a little bit of lag, but the goal is continuous access for both reading and writing your data.
Okay.
So the key takeaway there is built-in resilience against local failures. Less downtime for your critical data.
Got it. Like having multiple copies of your work in different buildings in the same city. Smart. Now, what happens if it's bigger than just one data center? The material mentions entire regions potentially going down, like an earthquake zone. That sounds way more serious.
Yeah, that raises a really important question about regional resilience. For these bigger, more widespread events, Microsoft uses geo-redundancy. Your OneLake data gets replicated to a completely separate region, like geographically distant. Now, the recovery time here is longer. The information said at least an hour.
An hour, okay.
And during this disaster recovery mode, your access to Fabric is read-only. So your Power BI reports and your actual data files in OneLake are still accessible, which is, a definite win if you need to see that info.
Right. Seeing the data is key.
Yeah. While regional failures are rare, it ensures your data is still accessible in a DR scenario. But there are limitations on what you can do with it. You got to plan accordingly.
Okay, so the reports are still there. Data is viewable. Big relief. But the source material also points out some pretty significant limitations during this recovery period. What were those again?
That's right. While that core data is viewable, your lakehouses, your data warehouses, data pipelines, notebooks, any ML experiments, they won't be up and running.
Okay. So the processing stuff is down.
Exactly. You'd essentially need to rebuild those in that secondary region, using your scripts in Azure DevOps, hopefully. It really highlights why having a solid disaster recovery strategy and automating as much of that process as possible is so critical.
Makes sense. So how do you actually turn this on in Fabric? It sounds like a must configure kind of thing.
You manage this through the Fabric admin portal. It's pretty straightforward to find.
Yeah.
Within the settings for your specific Fabric capacity, you'll find a disaster recovery toggle. It's important to note this is set at the capacity level, right? Not across your entire tenant by default. Gives you more specific control.
Okay, capacity level. Got it. Any catches?
Well, yeah, a few things to keep in mind. You'll need to be a capacity administrator or higher to flip the switch. Once you enable it, it's locked in for 30 days. You can't just toggle it off again immediately.
Oh, okay. 30-day commitment.
Right. And the initial copying of your data, the first sync, can take up to 72 hours. Plus, you need to think about your data governance policies and, naturally, the potential costs of replicating potentially large amounts of data to another region.
Okay, definitely not a set it and forget it button then. Planning is key. Let's switch gears now to who actually gets into Fabric in the first place. The material covers Entra ID authentication. That's the new name for Azure AD, right? That's his main job here.
Yep, Entra ID. At its core, it's all about verifying who a user is, basically answering the question, are you who you say you are? The login process, as described, is pretty standard. You try to access Fabric via your browser or an app. You get bounced over to Entra ID. It checks your username and password. If they're correct, Entra ID gives the thumbs up back to Fabric's web front end. That front end then talks to the metadata platform to figure out what you're actually allowed to see and do. That's the authorization piece.
Right, auth in and auth z.
Exactly. Then finally, you get access to the actual compute and storage in the back end. It's also worth noting Microsoft has its own security protecting that metadata platform and back end, like VNets and private endpoints. Stuff you don't directly manage, but it's there.
Okay, standard login flow. But the material really emphasizes that just a username and password isn't enough security these days. That's where conditional access comes in, right? Tell me about that.
Exactly. Conditional access is, well, powerful. It lets you create rules that react to specific login attempts. These rules can trigger extra steps before granting access based on certain conditions, like it can look at the user's IP address, their physical location. The example of blocking logins from unexpected countries was a good illustration of that.
Yeah, like Russia or North Korea probably don't want logins from there unless you expect them.
Right. Or even the type of device they're using. Is it a company-managed laptop or some random personal device?
That makes total sense, adding extra checks based on the context of the login. And on top of that, the recommendation is always have multi-factor authentication, MFA, turned on as well.
Absolutely. MFA is that crucial second layer. It requires another way to verify identity, like a code to your phone, an app notification, maybe a fingerprint. So even if someone somehow gets your password, they still need that second factor to actually get in. It's a huge security boost.
Definitely. Okay, so we know who can get in. Now let's talk about how Fabric handles connecting out to different data sources, especially ones behind firewalls. The material dives into networking, which it notes can be, well, complex. I remember setting up Synapse private endpoints. That was an experience.
Yeah, networking can get tricky fast. Fabric aims to make it a bit easier, hopefully. The material highlighted 3 key ideas here: manage private endpoints, workspace identities, and Azure Private Link.
Okay, 3 concepts. Let's start with Azure Private Link. What's the main idea there?
Azure Private Link is about maximum isolation, really. When you set it up, it restricts access to your entire Fabric environment so that it can only be reached through private network connections. Basically, it blocks all access from the public internet.
Wow, okay, so users have to be on the company network or VPN?
Exactly. Connected to your private network somehow.
Yeah.
And this is a setting that applies at the tenant level, so all traffic to and from your Fabric tenant then flows over Microsoft's private network backbone, not the public internet.
That sounds super secure, but the material also kind of questions if it's always necessary. It points out we already have strong login security with conditional access and MFA, and Fabric's backend is secured by Microsoft anyway, so.
Yeah, this brings up a really important point about balancing maximum security with usability and complexity.
Yeah.
Private Link offers the highest level of network isolation, for sure. But the source material highlights potential downsides, like you lose the ability to easily load data from, say, your local machine directly. You might see more bandwidth used on your ExpressRoute connection if you have one. There are extra costs for the private link endpoints themselves, and you can't use the on-premises data gateway with it enabled.
Right, the gateway needs public connectivity.
Exactly. So it's a very powerful option, and the material mentioned a case where it was implemented successfully. But thorough testing is absolutely crucial. You really need to weigh if the extra lockdown is worth the potential complexity and limitations.
Yeah.
It's not a default yes.
Okay, so think carefully, test thoroughly. Got it. Now, let's dive into workspace identities. This sounds like it's about Fabric reaching out to other services, not users coming in.
Precisely. A workspace identity allows your Fabric workspace itself to securely access other resources that are protected by firewalls. A good example is an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account that's locked down to only allow connections from specific networks or IPs. The big advantage here is that Fabric can authenticate to these services without you having to embed credentials, like account keys, directly in your Fabric connections.
Avoids the whole pasting keys everywhere problem. The material included a demo of this, right? Can you walk us through what that showed?
Absolutely. The demo aimed to show the secure way to access a storage account, one holding a sales CSV file, using a Fabric shortcut and this workspace identity. It started by showing the insecure way, which you should definitely not do, using the storage account's access key directly in the shortcut's connection settings.
Right. Bad practice.
Very bad.
Yeah.
Big risk if the key gets compromised. Plus, key rotation becomes a nightmare, breaking all your connections. The demo then showed what happens when you secure the storage account by restricting network access to only allow specific IPs. Predictably, the shortcut using the access key just stopped working because Fabric wasn't connecting from an allowed IP address anymore.
Right, because it was hitting the public endpoint, which was now blocked. So how does the workspace identity fix this?
Okay, here's the clever part. When you create a workspace identity in Fabric, Fabric actually creates a service principal behind the scenes. Think of it as a unique digital ID just for your workspace.
Like an application registration?
Sort of, yeah. A managed identity for the workspace. The next crucial step in the demo was granting this identity permissions on the target storage account. In this case, it needed the storage blob data reader role, assigned using Azure RBAC. Once that permission was set up, they created a new shortcut in Fabric. But instead of using the access key, it authenticated using the workspace identity.
Oh.
And presto. Even though the storage account was still locked down to specific networks, the Fabric shortcut could now successfully access the data because it's authenticating as the trusted workspace identity, which had been granted access. Much cleaner, much more secure.
That sounds way better than managing keys. The material mentions this is still in preview, but seems pretty stable.
Yeah, that was the note. Seems to work well, but officially in preview, so standard caveats apply.
Okay. Let's move on to the third networking concept. Managed private endpoints. This sounds like the flip side of Private Link. It's about Fabric connecting to private resources, right?
You've got it exactly right. Managed private endpoints are for when you need Fabric to access data sources that are completely isolated from the public internet. Think of an Azure Event Hub or maybe an Azure SQL database that lives inside its own virtual network and is protected by its own private endpoint. No public access at all.
Okay, so really locked down sources.
Yep. In this scenario, you create a secure private connection from within your Fabric environment to that specific private resource. You do this by setting up a managed private endpoint right inside the Fabric portal. The key here is you're creating a secure tunnel from Fabric to a specific lockdown resource, and it requires approval on the target service side.
And there was a demo for this too, connecting to a lockdown Azure SQL database. What did that show?
Right. The demo showed connecting a Fabric Spark notebook to an Azure SQL DB that had all public network access disabled, only reachable via its private endpoint. It started by showing an attempt to connect using a username and password directly in the notebook code.
Which, again, bad practice, but just for the demo.
Exactly, just to show it wouldn't work. And it didn't. Connection failed because public access was off.
Okay, database lockdown tight. What was next?
First step was creating the private endpoint in Azure for the SQL server itself, placing it within a dedicated VNet and subnet. Azure handles the DNS magics, the private IP resolves correctly within that network. Then the next step was creating the managed private endpoint within Fabric. This involved giving it a name in Fabric and, crucially, providing the specific resource ID of that target Azure SQL server. This basically sends a connection request from Fabric to that Azure private endpoint you just created.
And then someone on the Azure SQL Server side has to approve that request, right? Like saying, yes, Fabric Workspace X is allowed to connect.
Precisely. On the Azure SQL Server resource itself, in its private endpoint connection settings, a pending request from your Fabric environment appears. It needs explicit review and approval. Once that was approved in the demo, the Fabric notebook could suddenly connect successfully. It established the connection over that secure private network path. The material did note a current limitation, though. It seems this primarily works well with Fabric notebooks and Spark SQL definitions right now. An attempt to use it with a data pipeline failed during their testing, so it may be still evolving for other Fabric items.
Okay, so powerful for notebooks connecting to private SQL, maybe still expanding. Good to know. Let's shift focus now to the Fabric admin portal itself. The material really stresses how crucial this area is for overall security. What are some key areas we should pay attention to there?
Oh, absolutely. The admin portal is ground zero for settings that affect your entire tenant, specific capacities, and workspaces.
Yeah.
Huge impact on security posture. The example they gave of the publish to web setting is perfect. Terrifying, really.
Yeah, what does that do again?
If you enable it, it allows users to create Power BI reports that are just Publicly accessible. No login needed. Anyone with the link can see it.
Wow. Okay, massive risk for accidentally exposing sensitive data.
Huge risk.
Yeah.
So that's a prime example of a setting you need to be extremely careful with.
The material suggests asking ourselves two key questions when looking at any setting in the admin portal. What are those?
Good questions too. First, do we really need this setting enabled? If the functionality isn't absolutely essential for business needs, the strong recommendation is turn it off. Default to off.
The test first, right?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Test thoroughly afterwards to make sure disabling it doesn't break something critical you didn't expect. The second question is, if we do need this functionality, should it be enabled for everyone in the organization, or can we limit it? Can we restrict it to just a specific security group? Using security groups instead of enabling things for individuals is almost always better practice, more manageable, more secure.
Makes perfect sense. Limit the blast radius if something goes wrong or if needs change. What are some other important settings in the admin portal highlighted as particularly relevant to security?
Let's see. Guest settings are definitely critical. How external users can access your Fabric environment needs careful control and visibility. Also, the export and sharing settings. Things like allowing users to export data sets or reports to Excel, CSV, etc.
Right, data potentially leaving the controlled Fabric environment.
Exactly. You need to consider the risks there. Though they did caution about just blanket disabling export to Excel, as it might impact legitimate business use cases. It's a balance. Then there are governance-related settings, like restricting who can even create new workspaces. Maybe only central IT team should do that.
Good point.
And setting an appropriate retention period for deleted workspaces. The recommendation was to maybe increase it to the max, like 90 days, to help with accidental deletion recovery. There are a lot of settings in there. It really emphasizes that getting and keeping the configuration secure is an ongoing effort, not a one-time task.
Yeah, sounds like a constant process of review and adjustment. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to how security is enforced within Fabric itself, like inside workspaces and data items. The material talks about a multi-layer security model. What does that involve?
Yeah, this model relies on a combination of things working together. First, Entra ID for authentication, proving who you are, and then authorization, which is managed through permissions at the workspace level and the individual item level, like who can access this specific workspace or this specific report.
Okay.
On top of that, there are even more granular controls right at the data layer itself. Things like one-lake RBAC, which we'll get to, and also row-level security, column-level security, and object-level security within things like lakehouses, warehouses, and semantic models. So it's security at multiple depths.
Gotcha. It's not just about getting through the front door. It's also about what rooms you're allowed in, and maybe even what specific files or rows in those files you can see once you're inside. This brings us to workspace roles. How do those work?
Workspace roles are the primary way you grant access to a workspace. You assign users, or ideally security groups, to specific roles within that workspace. Strongly recommend using security groups, by the way. Managing individuals is a pain and prone to error.
Definitely. What are the main roles?
There are four main ones. Admin has full control, can delete the workspace, add other admins, read, write data, create items, everything. Member is similar to admin, but crucially cannot delete the workspace or manage its membership. Less commonly used, maybe. Contributor is very common, especially for data engineers. They can create items, read and write data, but can't manage workspace settings or members. And viewer is also very common, typically for business users. Read-only access to the workspace content reports, data sets, etc. Having a good, well-structured security group framework and Entra ID is really key to making these roles work effectively and keeping things organized.
Absolutely. Managing permissions at the group level is way more efficient. Now, the material goes even finer grained at the data level. Row-level security, RLS, column-level security, CLS, and object-level security, OLS. What's the purpose of these? Why need them if you have workspace roles?
Right. These are crucial because often, even within a workspace or a data set, not everyone should see all the data. Just because someone has viewer access to a workspace containing, say, a sales report doesn't mean they should see sales figures for all regions or all product lines. RLS lets you filter the rows a user can see based on their identity or role. The police data example was great. A constable sees their cases, a sergeant sees their whole team's cases. Same report, different data shown.
Okay, filters the rows. What about CLS and OLS?
CLS lets you restrict access to specific columns within a table. Maybe certain users shouldn't see sensitive columns like salary or profit margin, even if they can see other columns in the same table. And OLS allows restricting access to entire objects within a model, like hiding a whole table or measure from certain users. You often implement these using tools like Power BI Desktop or the tabular editor for semantic models, or even by defining security policies directly in Fabric warehouses using SQL. The core idea is the principle of least privilege applied directly to the data. Only let users see the specific slice of data they actually need.
That makes perfect sense, really dialing in who sees precisely what data. Super granular. Then we have OneLake RBAC. How is this different from the workspace roles or the RLS CLS stuff? It sounds like another layer.
It is another layer, specifically for accessing data stored in OneLake, especially within lakehouses. It operates kind of independently of the workspace roles. So remember, assigning someone a workspace viewer role gives them read access to all items in that workspace by default. OneLake RBAC lets you get much more precise than that, directly on the OneLake folders and files. You can create custom roles with very specific permissions, like maybe read only on this folder, but no access to that folder within the same lakehouse. And you assign these roles to users or security groups directly on the lakehouse or specific folders within it. So you could grant someone access to consume data from just one specific curated gold folder in a lakehouse without giving them viewer access to the entire workspace, where maybe bronze and silver data also lives.
Ah, okay. So it decouples data access within OneLake from the broader workspace access. There's a demo of this too, right? Giving a new user-specific table access.
Yep, exactly. The demo showed giving a user, let's call him Andy, very specific, limited access using OneLake RBAC. Initially, Andy had zero access to the admin's workspace. Instead of giving him a workspace role like viewer, the permissions were managed directly on the lakehouse item itself. A custom role was created called something like Gold Reader. This role was configured to only grant read access to specific folders within the lakehouse, maybe folders containing the final dimension and fact tables, while explicitly excluding folders with raw or intermediate data.
Okay, targeted folder access.
Right. And that was assigned this Gold Reader role. Now, when he looked at the lakehouse, he could see those permitted folders. But interestingly, initially, you couldn't see the actual data inside the tables within those folders. There was like a red X icon.
Huh. Why not? He had read access to the folder.
Because seeing the folder structure via OneLake RBAC doesn't automatically grant SQL select permissions on the tables within if you access via the SQL endpoint. So the next step in the demo was going into the SQL Analytics endpoint associated with that lakehouse and explicitly granting select permission on the specific tables Andy needed, like dim customer, dim date.
Ah, so two steps. OneLake RBAC for folder visibility, SQL permissions for table data access via that endpoint.
Exactly. After that second step, Andy could see the permitted folders and successfully query the specific tables he had select permission on via the SQL endpoint. He remained completely blocked from other folders and tables. It's powerful for granular control. The material did note, again, that this specific feature was still in preview and they'd seen some occasional flakiness during testing.
Okay, powerful, but maybe needs careful testing due to preview status.
Got it.
Finally, let's quickly touch on encryption. What does Fabric offer here? Is our data safe?
Yeah, encryption is pretty fundamental in Fabric. Good news is it's enabled by default for basically everything. For data at rest, when it's just sitting in storage in OneLake or elsewhere, Microsoft uses its own managed encryption keys. This covers your customer data, system data, metadata, the works.
Okay, so store data is encrypted by default. What about data moving around?
Data in transit, like when Fabric services talk to each other or when you connect over the internet, uses transport layer security, specifically at least TLS 1.2, and it negotiates up to the newer, more secure TLS 1.3 whenever possible. This helps prevent eavesdropping and, man-in-the-middle attacks. Standard, robust protection there.
So encryption is largely handled for us behind the scenes by Microsoft, which is definitely reassuring. Okay, now to bring everything together, we've covered a lot of ground. What are the absolute key takeaways from all this security information?
I think the biggest one is defense in depth. It's not about finding one magic bullet. It's about having multiple layers of security, identity, network, workspace permissions, data level security, all working together. No single point of failure.
Right, layers.
Second, that multi-layer approach needs to be coherent. Identity, Entra ID, network controls, and data permissions have to align. Third, always apply the principle of least privilege. Only grant the minimum access needed for someone or something to do its job.
Crucial.
Fourth, embrace a zero-trust mindset. Don't automatically trust requests just because they originate from inside your network. Verify explicitly. Fifth, have a well-defined and tested disaster recovery plan. That Heathrow example they mentioned really drives home the potential chaos if you don't.
Yeah, don't want that.
And finally, don't forget logging, monitoring, and auditing. You need visibility into what's happening in your Fabric environment to detect and respond to potential threats. Oh, and while we didn't dive deep into it today, remember Microsoft Purview is there for data governance and cataloging, another important piece of the puzzle.
Great summary. Layers, least privilege, zero trust, DR, and monitoring. And that final warning in the material really hit home, emphasizing the serious consequences if security isn't taken seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just theoretical risk. A security breach can lead to actual data loss, massive reputational damage, lawsuits, huge fines under regulations like GDPR, and frankly, people potentially losing their jobs. It's vital to prioritize security right from the start, even with a SaaS platform like Fabric, where Microsoft handles some of the underlying infrastructure. You still own the configuration and data security.
Definitely sobering, but essential to remember.
So, as you can hopefully see now, securing your Microsoft Fabric environment isn't about flipping one switch, right? It's a comprehensive approach, understanding all the different layers, how they interact, and configuring them properly to safeguard your data.
Totally. We've covered a ton today, from the physical data centers all the way down to super granular permissions on specific rows of data. Hopefully this deep dive has given everyone listening a much clearer picture of the key things to think about and, the practical steps you can actually take.
Yeah, and we really encourage you to maybe revisit the source material, dig deeper into the areas most relevant to you. What stood out most from our chat today? What questions are still kind of buzzing around in your head? This is definitely just the start of the conversation.
Absolutely. And remember that final thought we kept coming back to. Security isn't an afterthought you bolt on later. It needs to be a fundamental, baked-in part of how you approach your entire data strategy from day one. Thanks so much for diving deep with us today on Fabric Security. We'll catch you next time for another insightful exploration. Have a good one.
Until next time, stay secure.